Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helfer Parker, and today I have the pleasure of interviewing Mitzi and Scott Cannon. And they are with me today to share a personal experience, instead of from the professional perspective, more from the public perspective, in regards to pornography and being LDS and their struggles, maybe both individually and also as a couple, as they've tried to navigate much of the information and rhetoric that we see in Mormon culture around this topic. So welcome to the show, Mitzi and Scott.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So glad to have you on. And I think we'll just start with having you both briefly introduce yourselves.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm Scott, and I grew up in Salt Lake City all my life, and come from proud Mormon stock, going back to, well, my last name Cannon is a very Mormon last name, and also going back to Hiram Smith, Joseph F. Smith, and all that stuff. So raised in the church. My mom actually is a convert to the church, and that kind of played into some of my upbringing. Her mom was very against the church and didn't like it, and when my mom joined, that was a big sacrifice, and so my mom is a very committed member of the church, even for not having grown up in it. I went to BYU, and I served a mission in San Bernardino, California, speaking Spanish, and then I finished. I got a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, both in psychology from BYU. So I do have a bit of background on this stuff, which has been really helpful in sorting through a lot of my experience here.
And I'm just from a small town in Idaho, and I grew up very Mormon in a Mormon community, and I have Mormon pioneers on both sides, going back to, I don't even know, the beginning, and just grew up loving Mormonism, hardcore, good Mormon girl. Went to school at BYU, Idaho, and graduated from there and went to Salt Lake to do my student teaching, and that's where I met Scott.
Yeah, and I had been working the prior 3 summers or so as an EFY counselor, actually. We had an EFY get-together, and one of the girls that we had worked with the prior summer brought her roommate, who turned out to be Mitzi, so that's actually where we met, and we started dating right from then and there in January, and I proposed in July, and we were married in October of that year. So I followed. I had a friend in high school who taught me something he called the 4 seasons rule. He said, before you get married, you need to date someone for all 4 seasons, so you can see any quirks that come with different times of year that you might not be ready to get in for. So, I felt pretty proud that we took our time and really got to know each other well. And we got married in the Salt Lake Temple in 2005. So we've been married. It'll be 11 years this year, and we have 4 wonderful, noisy, energetic children.
How would you describe your Mormon upbringing?
My parents were definitely letter of the law, really strict Orthodox Mormons, follow the prophet. And as far as sexual messaging, I definitely got a lot of sex negative messaging. Whenever we were watching TV or anything, my mom would always be talking about immorality. But then at the same time, she would also talk about how important it was that men need sex. She was very much like, sex is bad and immoral, but men need it, and to be a good wife, you give your husband sex. That's kind of where my sexual education was.
Yeah, and my family was also very devout and very Orthodox, And but it was kind of interesting. My parents were different from a lot of my friends' parents, because my parents never grounded us, and there weren't a lot of real kind of hard consequences. They had more was the kind of teach them correct principles and let them govern themselves, but let them know that you disapprove when they make the wrong choice. And so there was kind of a lot of we joke about my dad's infamous disapproving look. That was the power he wielded to influence us growing up. We would shrink in our chairs and stuff like that. And so we were church every single Sunday, and always knew I was going to go on a mission, get married in the temple. As far as sexual messaging, there was almost none at all in my family growing up. So my dad took me to the maturation night, which I'm not sure if they still do that or if they do that everywhere. But for me, I think I was in 7th grade or something like that. And we went to the local elementary school, and they showed us this incredibly uncomfortable slideshow of, anatomy, and talked about puberty and stuff like that.
Through the church program or through the school program?
It was like through the school, I think,
School.
Yeah. And I lived across the street from the school, and so my dad and I walked over there, and I had no idea. Like they said, we're going to maturation night, and I had no idea what that was or what to expect. And then I saw all these pictures and diagrams of anatomy, and I was just mortified, because I never talked about any of that stuff with my parents, and they never talked about it. And my dad didn't say anything through the whole thing that I can remember. All I remember is when we were walking back, he said, "Do you have any questions about any of that?" And I was super embarrassed, and so I just said no. And that was the only kind of birds and bees talk that I ever had with either of my parents that I can remember. Was in 7th grade. And so, it was just kind of crazy, because we'd watch movies and stuff like that, like Monty Python and the Holy Grail, and there's that scene in there that has a lot of kind of sexual discussion, and my parents, like, they wouldn't skip it, and they wouldn't make a big deal. It's like they just wouldn't acknowledge it at all. We'd just watch it, and I would feel uncomfortable, and and feel all the kinds of weird stuff you feel when you're going through puberty, and there's sex discussion going on. And it's like I would look around, and it's like no one else was experiencing that. My parents weren't. It was just like this was no big thing. And I felt it almost left me feeling like there was something wrong with me, that I was having a reaction to this, and it didn't seem to be impacting anybody else at all. And I felt like I couldn't talk about it, because it's like no one else even noticed. So, but then at the same time, I remember one night my parents were out on a date, and I had turned on the original Beverly Hills 90210, which was on when I was a kid. And my sister told my mom when they got home, and my mom came down and kind of read me the riot act about how bad that show was, and how not to watch that show because they talked about sex. That's like one of the only conversations about sex I can remember as a kid growing up. So so there was just a lot of, I was very much left to my own devices to figure out what this aspect of my life and my experience as a person meant. And it was really hard. I didn't feel like I could talk to my parents at all, because they never talked about this stuff.
What kind of sense do you get as far as the sexual relationship that was being role modeled to you both from your parents?
My mom was pretty vocal about it, where she just stressed the importance of it, kind of in a way to keep your husband out of sin type of way. She talked about like how scheduled sex is the best idea ever. And so, I mean, she was kind of open about it, but never necessarily in this is a wonderful way, but this is in a way that you function as a couple. You have to take care of your sex fiend husbands. That's kind of the impression that I got.
Which is unfortunate, right? Because there's like some truth in what she's saying. Like scheduled sex can be actually really helpful for some couples, and it seems like she was trying to clue you into there's needs on both ends, but maybe not so much on the women's end was where maybe it was missing. Like there was this pleasure piece missing.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And it was more about controlling the drive or those kinds of messages. Okay.
Yeah, that's what I felt.
Okay. What about you, Scott?
So I'm the third of 5 kids, so I'm the middle child. And so I was still pretty young when my youngest sister was born. My parents were not very affectionate, at least publicly, even up until I was about to get married. I mean, for all I knew, the stork delivered all of us. Because I just got no sense of any kind of dynamic or thriving sexual relationship between my parents. They were both very proper and refined and educated and kind of had this almost professionalism about their relationship and stuff like that. And so that was what was modeled for me, and that was really hard for me. Because I've kind of been a hopeless romantic ever since I was little, and I remember just thinking, even as really as like 11 or 12, and just being so excited to get married and just to love my wife so much, and it would just be the most wonderful thing. And my parents' relationship just seemed so professional, I think, and I didn't want my relationship to be like that. I wanted my relationship to be more fun, and have more of that chemistry and stuff like that. But I mean, obviously something was happening because they had 5 kids. But as far as what was openly demonstrated and discussed, there was very little in my experience.
So both of you grew up in homes where, I mean, for all we know, they had great sex lives, but it wasn't this playful energy that either one of you could really pick up on, or this flirtatious energy between your parents.
No, not at all.
All right, so then let's start heading into the conversation about pornography itself. I mean, you both mentioned in your sex messaging that you received these ideas about modesty, whether it was through 90210 or whatever shows you were watching, I forget it, or whether it was directly stated to you, Mitzi, as far as this is immoral or this is immodest. Yeah. So how did we start getting educated about what pornography was? What were maybe your first experiences with pornography? And what do you remember the messages being around that topic, whether it's from parents or friends, or let's even start getting into church messaging?
So we're in our 30s, and it wasn't talked about hardly at all compared to now. I mean, we were just growing up with the internet. I remember in 8th grade, we kind of started using the internet in computer class. And so I didn't grow up ever in church hearing really about pornography or hearing it talk to me, especially as a girl. So I was pretty clueless about it until college, and I still didn't know much about it. So then I'll let Scott carry on from there.
Yeah, so my first exposure was I was over at a friend's house, and he said, "Hey, let's go take a walk." And he was an LDS kid, but his family wasn't super Orthodox stuff. And he said, "Hey, let's go walk over behind this big grocery store because sometimes people leave pictures back there." And I didn't know what he was talking about, but I knew it was something kind of secret or exciting. And so I went with him, and we found
How old are you at this point?
So I was probably 12. And so we went back there and found like a magazine, and I still remember the image very clearly. So I was 12, so it was early 90s. I still just remember the lady had kind of that big, poofy, curly, late 80s, early 90s hairdo. So I felt a lot of different things, but again, I had no framework for interpreting this stuff. But I knew, it was shocking and uncomfortable, but also exciting and novel and all these things. But not a whole lot came of that. I didn't really feel guilty or ashamed or anything like that. It just felt like a very potent experience that I hadn't had before. Then, time went on, and so back in the days before digital TV, when you got TV wired into your house, it came in with cable, with all the cable channels like HBO and stuff like that, but they were scrambled. But if you were a really determined teenager and really patient, you could sit up late at night watching these scrambled HBO channels or things like that, and you could see something between all of the scrambling every once in a while, and you could hear the sound. The sound came through fine, so you could hear something naughty was happening, and occasionally you could actually make out an image or something like that. So that was what where my curiosity was pushing me before the internet became available. And then there was kind of a traumatic experience where around the same time, two people that I was very close to got found out to have been looking at internet pornography. And so I got to watch how my friends reacted to that, how my family reacted to that, how our church community reacted to that. And it was very bad. I mean, there was just so much shame and fear and disgust and revulsion and all these things. And that scared me bad. But in one of the cases, one of my friends actually found stuff on another one of my friend's computers, and he showed me how he found it. He was able to go and kind of work back through the files to check, what his internet history was back before it was built in. And he found a bunch of stuff on there. And actually, as a joke, cruel joke, he ended up blowing it up on his computer screen so his parents would find it, which they did.
Oh, wow.
And it was a very horrible experience for him.
Can you talk a little bit about, more in detail, this reaction that
He was like out playing basketball or something in the back. Because there were like 5 or 6 of us over at this time, and so there were a few out playing basketball, and then a few of us were inside. And anyway, they did that and had this good laugh. And I just remember, it's like seeing this stuff and just feeling really, a lot of those feelings again, that excitement and that thrill and that curiosity and all these things, but then at the same time feeling very ashamed of those feelings because I could see the judgment from my friends. And by this time I was, probably 14 or 15 and had started getting more of those church messages about how bad this was.
Were most of your friends LDS? Like, did you live in an LDS type of area?
Yeah, and all of us were in the same ward and grew up together. And so, from kindergarten, I had basically the same group of friends all the way up through high school and missions and everything like that. And we were all in the same ward. And so, this was kind of an everybody found out type situation, which terrified me and made me feel so bad for this other friend. And so,
I'm sorry to interrupt again. Do you know much about how he was able to handle that?
All I know is that he got up in a testimony meeting a couple of weeks later and just talked about how his parents had been so wonderful and he felt like they loved him so much and stuff like that, and that he had struggled with, all very kind of ambiguous, that he'd been struggling, but his parents, had been so great. And knowing his parents, I'm not sure exactly what their reaction was like, but I have a feeling it was probably fairly similar to what my parents would have done, where I would have felt, loved and everything like that, and like they were wanting to work through it with me. But it would have been very clear that this was very bad, and this was something that was not acceptable behavior.
There would have been no normalizing of the process or the curiosity or sexual desire or things of that nature.
No, and again, I don't know, but that seems very improbable to me. For all of our parents, I mean, that's just at the time there was this was new territory, I think, for parents
well.
and kids.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the internet was just bringing all kinds of new and fun challenges to deal with. So I started finding ways to access it myself, and my parents did all the classic stuff of putting the computer in the kitchen and putting on some filters and stuff like that. But that's where there's a will, there's a way, and all that stuff was easily worked around. I always felt terrible about doing this. It was this compulsive thing, and I would lay up in my room and just be tearing myself apart, struggling with my body and these urges and stuff like that, and knowing that all I had to do was go downstairs and turn on the computer and everything would be right there, and I could resist that for a few days and stuff like that, but then it was almost like I felt almost like I was possessed, like some other force was lifting my body out of the bed and driving me down the stairs. And I remember I would be physically shaking fairly violently. I don't know if it was the adrenaline or what, but I remember feeling or thinking about my deceased ancestors. Like, I think my grandfather, who had been a pretty high hitter in the church, had passed away fairly recently, and I remember sitting there in the dark in the kitchen in the middle of the night and looking at this stuff and feeling so badly and like I was doing something so horrible, and imagining the spirit of my deceased grandfather there standing over my shoulder, shaking his head in disapproval and disappointment. And sometimes I would really try to hold on to that to make myself feel even worse, in the hope that would deter me, even for one extra day or something like that. But overall, I mean, I just felt increasingly awful about myself as this continued to be a problem that I didn't know how to solve and didn't seem like it was going to be going away.
Just a few clarifying questions around this time frame. It sounds like you're getting a little older as you're talking. So this starts at 12. Now maybe you're 13, 14, 15 as all of these things are happening. And I'm assuming masturbation is happening for you as well.
That actually happened a little bit later. I remember I went to soccer camp at like Utah State or something like that one summer. And there were a bunch of non-LDS kids, and they were talking about all kinds of stuff. And so they were talking about having sex with their girlfriends and stuff, 14, 15-year-olds. And this was just, I was so unprepared and out of my depth with this. And they talked about masturbation and stuff too. And I didn't really get what they were talking about, but they talked about like, oh yeah, it's awesome, it feels so good and all this stuff, and can't believe you Mormon squares don't do this stuff, what's wrong with you and everything. And so then it was a couple of weeks or months after that I actually kind of figured that out by accident and felt like I had done something really serious, and like, what does this mean? This can't be good. And for years, I felt like going to soccer camp that summer had ruined my life, because that's what had set off this chain of events. And that if I could go back and undo one thing in my life, it would be to not go to soccer camp, because that had set me on this slippery slope to moral degeneracy that I felt like I was trapped in.
And do you feel or know if you had any potential for anxiety disorder or depression as far as just mental health perspectives that maybe could have been attributing to this as well, right? So there's kind of like what I talk about, the trifecta. You've got family culture, you've got church culture, and then you've got mental health stuff. So you've got kids who hear the same amount of weird messages around sexuality, and not everybody has the same response to that due to, a variety of environmental, personality differences. We could come up with 50 different things as to why those varieties exist. So how do you perceive yourself in that perspective?
Yeah, for me, it was definitely the trifecta. I didn't know much psychology stuff at that age. It wasn't something that my family was very versed in. And so I didn't understand really depression and anxiety and stuff like that until a couple years later, as it's really started to get bad for me. But it does I believe run in my family, and so looking back, yeah, I think that was definitely an exacerbating factor in this whole thing. But just a couple of the messages that I was getting around this time. So I think like a lot of kids, they say, oh, like, I'm struggling with this now, but when I get married and I have a legitimate outlet for this, it will be okay. I just have to hold out until I can get married, and then all these problems will be solved. And just really desperately holding on to that hope. And I remember one, I think it was Aaronic priesthood meeting, like as part of stake conference or something like that, around this time, where they told a story about some young couple that was dating, and they were wanting to get married, but he had a masturbation habit, and he hadn't been able to kick it. And the young woman, I guess, talked to her priesthood leader and said, like, but when we get married, I'll be able to take care of this for him. And the kind of moral punchline of the story was, if he can't learn to control it before you're married, he'll never be able to control it once you are married, or something like that. And so then I thought, holy smokes, okay, so I have to fix this before I get married. Like, it'll be easier once I get married because I'll have that, but it's like, I can't expect marriage to fix me. I need to fix this before, or else, and very much got the impression that they were saying with that story, you shouldn't marry this guy because he can't control himself. And so I thought, wow, I really have to get this under control, or else no one's going to want to marry me. And so there was that message. And then another really bad one was that around that time, the story of Ted Bundy was going around, that on death row, he blamed pornography for his descent to becoming a serial killer.
That's right.
And I don't know if you've seen that video. You can find it on YouTube, and I see it kicked around every once in a while for people saying, "Behold the horrible dangers of pornography use." As he says, every guy in here started out with pornography, and he said, I started out with it, and and it was exciting, but then I needed more. And so it got harder and harder, and then looking wasn't enough, and I had to start acting out, and then acting wasn't, just sex wasn't enough, and then I had to start getting violent, and ultimately ended up killing a bunch of women.
Which, by the way, let me just interrupt, is one of the critiques of the addiction model, is that it's used as an excuse for really awful behavior. And also, just to piggyback on the interview I just did with Dr. Nicole Prouse, she talks about there's no research to support that watching pornography does not create violence. Even violent pornography, unless you're predisposed to being violent yourself, doesn't just automatically create violent people. So anyway, sorry to interject there.
No, and I'm so glad you did, because that's exactly the interjection I wish someone would have made in this meeting, because there was no interjection. And so I started internalizing that and thinking, okay, if I don't get this under control, not only is no one going to want to marry me, but I have now set myself on the path through my own moral weakness and failing to where I am on the slippery slope to becoming a Ted Bundy if I don't figure out how to fix this.
Wow.
And that, I mean, was horrifying to me. Because like I said, I was such a hopeless romantic and just fantasizing about being married and how wonderful it would be, and thinking about harming a woman, or any woman, or my future spouse, or whatever, was just so morally discordant to me, that it was unbearable. Fast forwarding a little bit to where I was in high school, I think junior or senior in high school, and this movie Seven came out, which I don't know if you're familiar with it, but
Awful movie.
yeah. Yes, it is.
Regret seeing that movie.
Yeah, so I was over at a buddy's house, and it was just the two of us. He said, "Hey, you want to watch this movie? It's crazy." And I was like, "Sure." For those who haven't seen it, it's about this serial killer who kills people, chooses victims modeled after the 7 deadly sins, and each murder is designed kind of as a sermon to preach against the 7 deadly sins. And but there was a line at the end which really just hit me and kind of resonated with this messaging that I'd gotten about me kind of being a moral time bomb almost, and that if I didn't succeed in diffusing myself and fixing myself, then it was only a matter of time before I started doing horrible things. And there's a line at the end of the movie where, after these detectives have seen all of these horrific murders, Morgan Freeman's character says, if we find this guy and he turns out to be Satan, I mean the devil himself, it might live up to our expectations. But he's not the devil. He's just a man. And that just hit me in a way that I thought, holy smokes, I could be that man. I'm just a man. And people are capable of horrible, horrible things. Ergo, I am capable of horrible, horrible things. And if I'm not careful, I could end up being this horrible, horrible person. That's the level at which I was thinking about this problem. That I am looking at pornography, I can't stop myself. I can go for a while, but then I always backslide. And the longer this goes on, the further down that path I get. What am I going to do when I get to the point where I realize I might hurt somebody? And, that's where I started, really considering suicide as my kind of moral imperative.
What age are you at this point?
So I was probably 16, 17. I had already had some kind of suicidality based more on spiritual stuff and scriptural stuff, which we can talk about too. But this just really hammered at home that, I basically felt like a serial killer in embryo, or a latent sociopath, something like that. And that if I wasn't eternally vigilant, if I lapsed, even 1 minute on some of this stuff, I could end up killing somebody. And that was a horrible burden to live with.
It's interesting as you're talking, the amazing, profound impact I think that you're trying to reach out to the audience about is how much these messages can really spiral into things that make sense when you understand the rhetoric that we grow up with. Again, not everybody spirals down to those kinds of thoughts, but it's more common than we think. And
and I run into it more and more and more.
Yeah,
which is
I think
part of why I'm doing this.
Right. I think people are surprised when I explain that I commonly have adolescents in my office who are either suicidal or cutting themselves. It often comes down to things like this, like, well, I am masturbating. I feel like my masturbation is out of control, or I feel like my porn use is out of control. Again, when I ask about frequency with Mormons, it tends to be not so frequent. We're talking about maybe once a week, once a month, even once every 3 months, even once a year can seem out of control to a lot of these people, which all of those frequencies fall under normal human behavior as far as the rest of the world is concerned. Well, the rest of psychiatric world, however we want to describe that. And this really causes some huge issues. And then there's the chicken and the egg. Some people, I think, have a predisposition for anxiety and depression, and so these messages are maybe harder to hear, they're not as resilient to maybe roll their eyes at some of these messages, like I see actually quite a few teenagers doing in our wards.
Yeah.
But then I think also
I have a good friend who did that.
Yeah, like they're crazy, or they don't know what they're talking about, or they're old people, and they kind of don't listen to a lot of that. But many people do listen, and it tends to be those who want to be very righteous and want to do what's right. So it's kind of sad that we're affecting those kind of kids in this way. And what I have found too is that it's not always the predisposition to depression or anxiety, that it can actually become situational depression and anxiety because of those messages starting. So it's interesting, not that we're always able to understand exactly what comes first, but I think that there's definitely an argument to be made that had these messages not been there, there wouldn't be clinical depression or anxiety disorders for some.
Yeah, and I have kind of come to really ponder about that, when you talk about that trifecta and things, and where it's like when we've talked to some people, they kind of want to blame my experience with pornography and stuff like that, and all this pain and stuff on my mental health predisposition. Not everyone's going to have this reaction to these kind of messages. You were kind of predisposed to internalize it in this very charged and dangerous way. But I really feel like these messages and the shame built into these messages, I took that, and that really just inflamed my disposition for depression and anxiety that was already there, but I don't think ever would have gotten to the level that it got to without, it's like I had this little campfire and someone dumped a gasoline truck, crashed the gasoline truck into it. The fire was already there, but it was contained, and it would have been not a huge issue, or very much within normal parameters. But these messages and stuff just caused it to get absolutely out of control. And so I really feel like for some people, I love that you brought that up, that idea of situational depression, and even situational suicidality. And where it's like, I would not be thinking about killing myself if I didn't believe these things that I've been told to believe. So when I gave my kind of testimony about this stuff in our ward a couple of weeks ago, a couple of the reactions really hit on that, where people were like, oh, well, he just, you're not supposed to believe that. Like, you're not supposed to take that stuff seriously, or, oh, he's just believing the wrong way, and everything like that. And what I wanted to respond to that, and what I want to put out there is, we have to take it more seriously and think about, okay, what are we going to do if our youth do believe us? When we say sexual sin is the sin next to murder in the eyes of God, why shouldn't we expect them to believe that and to feel accordingly? Because I absolutely believed that. And when we tell kids to read the scriptures, like, oh, you're struggling, read your scriptures. And there are so many horrible scriptures out there. I made a big list of them the other day. And, one in particular that was very damaging to me is Doctrine and Covenants 82:7, I think it is, that says, to the soul that repenteth, he shall be forgiven, but unto the soul that sinneth shall all the former sins return. And I read that, I don't remember at what point in my life, but that lodged in my brain. And so every time that I would lapse or backslide or whatever, I felt like I was undoing all of the former repentance that I had done. And coupled with the scripture, the Alma 39:5, that sexual sin is the sin next to murder, taking those two together, and I'm just like, the longer I live, the worse off my standing with God is. Because all it's going to take is some freak accident, a car accident or whatever, or the second coming, to strike after I've relapsed. And having relapsed, all of those former times that I'd struggled so hard to repent of are null and void. And it's like I've just done all of this horrible stuff anew, and I'm going to be dead meat. And oblivion is going to be my greatest hope and wish, rather than standing before God under the weight of all of these horrible sins. And so, it's really frustrating to me when people try and say, take this seriously, but don't take this seriously. With messaging in the church, and I just really think people need to ask themselves, what if they believe me? What if I say this and these kids I'm talking to believe me? What if they believe me that porn leads to becoming a serial killer? Like, what is that going to do? Is that risk really worth the message I'm trying to convey?
So there's several thoughts I have. I think it's very disingenuous to minimize people's experiences in the church by blaming prior mental health conditions, or, again, like you're saying, you're just reading it wrong, or this isn't what is meant by what is said, when you're absolutely right. We have tons of scriptures and tons of over-the-pulpit talks by not just local leaders, but leaders that go all the way to the top, where we have a culture that says what they say is just as good as scripture, that are very damaging, and that to young, impressionable minds leave a huge impact. And this inability to have a spectrum of behavior. So when we say things like, sexual sin is next to murder, there's no ability to really look at that from the perspective of sexual sin, if you want to call whatever sin.
Yeah, there's no qualification.
Is like, there's so many different sexual behaviors, right? And there's no way that you can compare two 17-year-olds touching each other's genitals in consensual, kind of immature puppy love form, to somebody who is, raping a child who's in their 40s or 50s, right? I mean, there's just no comprehension of what that could mean, and no explanation. And so you take a young kid who still is pretty egocentric, they're going to apply what they're hearing to their own lives. They don't have the skills.
Yeah, they're going to liken the scriptures unto themselves, like they're told to.
Exactly. And so they're going to use that information to, they must be talking about the fact that I'm masturbating. They must be talking about the fact that I'm, kissing or having sex with my boyfriend or girlfriend, or looking at pornography, or those kinds of things, at which we can have value statements on those things, and all parents, have a right, and even, I guess, churches have a right to talk about sexual values, but there has to be a ton more explanation versus just throwing some type of generic statement like that out there that is incredibly explosive.
Yeah, and I think too that just underscores the danger of having a negativist approach to sexuality, where it seems like the church and a lot of parents look at sexuality of, well, if we don't talk about it, it won't exert an influence, or it won't, people won't get into trouble because they won't know how, and it's like, and the more we talk about it, the more, people are it's gonna become a part of someone's life. And that's, I think, a really wrong-headed approach, because, I think a positivist approach is much more reasonable, because sexuality is hard-coded into our brains since, our lizard ancestors or whatever. It's as hard-coded as eating, sleeping, and survival. I mean, it's one of the very basic functions of life. And so it is going to be there, and it is going to exert an influence whether we talk about it and acknowledge it or not. And so taking this negativist approach where, if we just ignore it, or, only give the barest minimum of information about it, that's somehow going to be beneficial and keep people out of trouble, I think is just really wrong-headed. And so what you have is, you have kids, like me, where the only messages about sexuality we've gotten are very kind of negative and shame-based and cautionary and fear-based and things like that. And then, so that's the kind of the underlying assumption through which we are going to interpret all other information about sexuality that we encounter, because that's all we've ever heard about it. When you hear the scripture, sexual sin is the sin next to murder, without qualification, in my mind, I read the other scripture where Jesus says, you've been told, thou shalt not commit adultery, but I say unto you, a man who looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. And thinking, okay, if I look at a girl, one of the cheerleaders at the high school football game, and lust after her, that is the same thing as adultery in the eyes of God. And I need to feel the same shame and guilt and urgency to repent, as if I had actually gone and done something like that. And you have no way to know any different, because no one's going to tell you any different unless they do, and bless their heart if they do. But no one ever told me. And so I was just left to organize all of this stuff by myself. And yeah, I organized it in a very destructive way, which I feel like is exactly how I should have been expected to organize it based on the scant information that I did get.
I agree with that. And I think that the only way, and I hate to say this ad nauseum, but the only way to really be a righteous youth or single adult in our church is to be asexual.
Yeah,
because
that was my goal.
That's the description in the youth for youth pamphlet. It's not just don't have premarital sex or be careful about how you wield your sexual responsibility. It's do not have thoughts, do not have desire, do not arouse those thoughts in yourself, which of course
because it's all next to murder.
Right,
all next to murder as far as God's concerned.
That's just a description of somebody who's asexual, which is not a very large portion of our population by any means.
Yeah, and is that even what we want? And that
it's not what we want.
No.
Because that's how I was. I was that, and it's taking me 10 years to have any kind of fulfillment in the bedroom. It's not good.
Yeah,
both extremes are not good.
Yeah, and that's what was so frustrating for me, because it's like I failed to live up to the model and had all these problems over here, and then Mitzi succeeded at fulfilling the model and had all these other problems. Yep. And so when we got married, we got to merge together these
dysfunction.
These two very disparate forms of dysfunction. And we were completely unprepared for how to work through that stuff, and it's been extremely difficult. And when I see these good Mormon kids getting married, my heart just aches for them, because I think that the minority are going to be going into starting a sexual relationship, a committed sexual relationship with another adult human being, just totally unprepared to succeed at that endeavor.
Yeah, and I hate to be blithe when I say this, but this is what keeps me in business. And
Yeah,
it's
I absolutely believe
exactly
it.
those two spectrums that you're talking about. It's either I felt like I was hypersexual, out of control, basically for having normal drives, when I assess for the frequency and the quantity and the quality, or I was successful and now I'm expected to just kind of turn it all back on because of this magical one day where we said a few words across an altar, and I don't know how to do that, and now I don't know how to engage with this kind of potential that I've been given, and that brings great sadness too. So it is a combination of really difficult and in my view, tragedy positions for people to be in, because it's unnecessary. I think that's the definition of tragedy, is that it's unnecessary loss, because we could be doing such a much better job, especially with what I think are some potentially sex positive messages that Mormonism could embrace. But we just don't really do that. So a few things, again, that I just want to just say as you've been talking. First of all, the research, and I have a great interview with Al Vernacchio, who is a sex educator, but the research shows that how we are doing sex education is failing anyway. So I don't know why we're so tied to that approach of, like you're saying, shaming and silence and not giving resources to youth. The pregnancy rates are always higher. The sex exploration is always greater when everything is kind of taboo and hidden in secret. And as far as the anxiety bias, I want to go back to that because I have seen, anxious kids who are not Mormon. I don't just work with Mormons, believe it or not. And when you have parents who are coming in and saying, honey, it's okay if you masturbate, like, relax. What are you so up in arms about? Because kids pick up messages from other areas too. And sometimes these kids have OCD issues. It is interesting how the kid might still struggle because they're dealing with an anxiety disorder. But it's a very different, more normalized struggle than what you're describing. Which, by the way, I don't know how the audience feels. And Mitzi, I'd like to maybe even get your perspective, or Scott, yours. But I mean, just going back and looking at this 12-year-old, 13-year-old, 15-year-old, 17-year-old version of Scott, there's something very empathic in me that reaches out, and wants to reach out and just tell that kid, dude, it's okay. It's going to work out. It's very difficult to hear in some ways. It just pulls at your heart. And
I know, I want to hug 16-year-old Scott.
Yeah. And just say, please come talk to me about this. And
not that I would have been able to handle it at the time, but it's just sad.
And as we've talked about this stuff, and I mean, there's so, like, this just, it framed my life so much.
It framed your whole identity.
Yeah, and so, I mean, there's like, I've written lists of all the different kind of, pivotal moments and things like that, and I'm always forgetting stuff and remembering new things later. I'll bring it up and talk to Mitzi about it, and there are so many times when she's just like, I can't handle your story. It is too painful and it is too sad. And and as I write this stuff down, I'm just like, man, what a mess. Like, I feel so grateful that I have
just lucky that you function as well as you do.
Yeah, that I've survived as well as I have.
You're quite resilient. Exactly.
Yeah, and I think that I had a thought where based on this and just other things that I've seen with people, where people are simultaneously much more resilient and much more fragile than we tend to think, in the sense that we can harm people, as I was harmed by one little message in a priesthood meeting in 1991. And just do incredible damage, and yet at the same time people are able to push through and overcome some really tremendous obstacles and work through some really overwhelming pain. So it's just people are are incredibly complex. So I wanted to just hit the real low point of this, where I actually was diagnosed with OCD as a result of the symptoms I was experiencing. So this was my freshman semester at BYU. So I went down to BYU, and I was still struggling. And I remember I put a picture of Joseph Smith, and I put a picture of the temple, and taped them up to my computer screen in my dorm room, so that I would be dissuaded from, so basically it would amplify any shame that I did feel. And it did make me feel worse about myself. But like I said, I felt like I could resist for so long. And then it's like something else would take possession of my body and go do what I need to do. And it's like the part of my brain and body that operated 99% of the time was helpless to do anything about it. And it was just incredibly hopeless. And so I just got more and more anxious and felt more and more terrible. And also at this time, so I was living alone, which was a bad idea. And just because I had so much time to sit in my own thoughts, to sit in my depression, to sit in my anxiety, and no one to talk to, and no kind of reality checks there. And so I just started getting very symptomatic. And I didn't understand this at the time. I'd always kind of had OCD tendencies, just like always keeping things at right angles, and I was always very neat and organized and clean. But what I didn't realize was part of OCD was the invasion of those anxiety-producing thoughts and obsessions and things like that cause this anxiety, which then you react by doing these compulsions to re-exert kind of this sense of control when you're feeling out of control, like your mind is out of control, and that feels very frightening. And so I remember walking across campus, BYU, and I would look at people, and I would have these visions pop into my head of me just murdering a person in some horrible way, taking a brick and smashing their skull in, or just seeing some girl passing by on campus and having some image pop into my head of just like raping this girl or something like that. And I felt like I was going insane. Even worse, I felt like that latent serial killer was trying to come out, and that I was, and that's another one of those messages, that thoughts lead to words, words lead to actions, actions lead to character, and character leads to destiny, or whatever that line of reasoning is. And I thought, holy cow, I'm already thinking like a serial killer. I'm thinking like a murderer. And I am at the point where it's going to take very little for me to step over that threshold and start doing this stuff. Then I started fantasizing about suicide. Like, I remember sitting at my desk studying, and I looked down and had this vision of my wrists just opening up and blood just pouring out of my arms. And then I think it was the same day I looked out the window at the building across and saw, and had an image pop into my head of myself hanging from the roof of that building. Like I, tied a rope and had jumped off the edge of the building and was swinging dead in front of some poor kid's dorm window. My brain was just incredibly sick. And so there was a flyer that someone had put up in the dorm bathroom for a depression screening. And I thought, hey, I might be depressed. I should probably go see for sure. And so I went to this screening, and I filled out the little bubble sheet and stuff like that. And most of my stuff was kind of in normal ranges, because I think I was kind of underestimating how depressed I was. But then it got to the suicide part, and I marked pretty high on all of that stuff. So that immediately flagged me as someone for them to follow up with. So they got me in working with, meeting with some PhD student in the psychology program.
This was the BYU Counseling Center?
Yeah, at BYU. I had seen a counselor before, just like a couple times in high school, as I was dealing with some depression stuff, and my brother had been seeing someone. I told my mom I was interested in going, and and it was okay. I didn't really know how to utilize it most effectively to help me. But by this time, I was really ready to get in and talk to someone and work some stuff out. And so I remember just telling this kid all of these things, about, imagining myself murdering people, random people on campus, every day, and running people over in my car, and just all these things. And I just remember his face. He was a student still, so he was learning, but
he hadn't
just this
managed the blank therapy face yet.
Yeah, so he just got this kind of restrained but horrified look on his face, like, wow, I am totally unprepared to deal with this guy, with this client. And which I thought was fine. I just wanted to talk to somebody about it. But it was really helpful because he, the second time I went, he's like, so I looked up some of the stuff you were talking about, and it looks like you're experiencing OCD. And he explained that idea of the invasive thoughts that you can't control coming in. And that broke that piece for me of thinking I was a serial killer. Because suddenly, I'm not a serial killer. This is my brain playing tricks on me. This doesn't mean anything. If I look at someone and have some image pop into my head, that's not my real horrible self trying to break out. Like, that's just my brain playing tricks on me. And that was just incredibly liberating, and really probably why I ended up studying psychology, because that was life-changing and probably life-saving for me. That normalizing conversation where, oh, this is something that we know about and we kind of understand and that other people deal with. And it's not just that you are a horrible person and you actually want to murder people. This is a known condition where your brain does this to you, and it doesn't mean you actually want to do these things. And so that just was, life-changing for me. But they still sent me over to meet with the psychiatrist and get on medication, and I didn't really understand it at the time. He diagnosed me with OCD and said to start taking some medication, and I took it for like 2 or 3 days, and I was like, this isn't working, and so I stopped taking it because I guess I didn't pay attention to, it takes a while and stuff like that. But still, just that understanding of what was happening to me was so powerful that I almost felt like I didn't really need that anymore.
Did you notice some of the compulsive behavior going away after that session?
Yeah. I got to the point where I was walking across campus and I wouldn't step on cracks, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cliche. Am I doing this because I saw it in a movie or whatever? And so I remember I would try to force myself to step on a crack just to prove that I wasn't being totally ridiculous. And I would move my foot like at the last second so I wouldn't step on it. So, just the compulsion and like everything was really, really at the worst extremes I had experienced. And then after that, all that stuff just started to recede and started to come back kind of within normal levels. I still have stuff like that sometime, and I think most people do. I think that's fairly normal, where I'll have some violent or otherwise image or thought pop into my head, and it's here 1 second, gone the next, and there's no meaning, there's no weight assigned to it, so it doesn't create that horrible anxiety reaction that it was when I thought it actually meant something about myself.
Power of normalization is significant. Yes.
Yeah,
sure.
It was incredible.
Moving over to Mitzi a little, I think you already answered this with your asexual comment, but along the way, as you're developing into an adult, what is your sexual journey looking like? It sounds like there wasn't any masturbation or fantasy or...
Okay. No. I didn't even know that girls could masturbate. I mean, I didn't know any of that, and I didn't really have much of a sex drive, and I would have a lot of crushes, and I would, I really liked boys and was very much into the flirtatious part of it, but not sexual at all. And when we got married, like on our honeymoon, I didn't have any desires. I was very willing, with the way that I'd been taught. Like, I knew I wanted to be a good wife, and so I was very
we
willing.
were supposed to do it. So
yeah, and I didn't think it was bad. I honestly, I was a health education major in school, and I didn't think, a part of me didn't think that sex was bad at all, but I still just hadn't owned it at all for myself. And it's taken 10 years. That's a long story.
Yeah. And after I had this kind of breakthrough and started to feel better about myself, and then of course I went on my mission, and there's this phrase that I hear going around a lot, and a lot of times it seems very tied to the addiction model, but it's called fill your life with good things, as a way to keep from falling into these bad habits and things like that, like looking at pornography or masturbation or whatever, these things you're trying to extinguish. The way to do that is to fill your life with good things, so that there's no room for those bad things. You don't have time, you don't have energy for it. And that's really what I tried to do. So before my mission, I had a couple of months, and I had been sober, to use that term, which I don't really like, but for convenience sake, I'd been sober for quite a while, and was getting ready to go on my mission, and I just knew Satan was going to try and get me. He was going to try and get me to relapse and try and get me to not be worthy to go on my mission. And so I would go down to Temple Square and to the distribution center, and I would buy picture, those big Book of Mormon pictures and temple pictures, and I would put them up all over my room, so that anywhere I looked, I was seeing good things. I was seeing the temple. I was seeing, the first vision. I was seeing Nephi and all this stuff, and it really buoyed my spirit, and I felt like it really helped me to be in a good place for that time. And so then I went on my mission, and everything was going great, but missions can be very difficult. Past halfway through my mission, I ended up backsliding again and just felt horrible. And I went and I had another policy, which again goes back to one of the messages I heard as a teenager, where in another meeting we were told the story about a young man who had sex with his girlfriend or something like that. And she felt really badly about it, but he didn't. And so she went and told the bishop. He told her, well, in order to really repent of this, it's like we need to talk to the young man as well. So she told him who it was. And this young man just denied it. So he denied it to the bishop. And then he went to the stake president, and he denied it to the stake president. And then it was seen by like a general authority, like a 70 or something like that. The 70 told him, because he denied it to him too, and he said, now, son, let me explain something to you. If you lie to me about this sin, and you actually did commit it, then you will not receive forgiveness in this life nor in the life to come. And at that, he realized that it wasn't worth his soul, and so he confessed. And so I had that in my mind. So I had developed a policy early on that I would never lie to a priesthood leader. I would tell all of my priesthood leaders that I had this problem, and let the chips fall where they may. Wasn't worth my soul, and maybe it would actually save my soul if they told me something that I could do that would absolve me. Then that's absolutely what I wanted. Even as scary as it was to think of being revealed to my friends and family and parents as the perverse, repulsive person that I felt like I was.
And I want to interject just for whoever might be listening, because sometimes there's people who are not Mormon who listen and people who are still very believing and active who listen. And so I just want to
Mhm.
clarify that it's not doctrinal and it's not supported
No.
by Mormon doctrine. So
No.
I just want to.
But it got that kid to confess.
Well,
that's
for sure. But in that conversation, we have to really understand that although Mormonism is pretty highly correlated, there's this thing that we call bishop's roulette or leadership roulette, which means depending on which leader you tend to sit down with in an office, you can get very different results, very different understanding of what Mormon doctrine is. And sometimes that goes really well and is very healing for people. And other times it's actually quite traumatizing. So I just want to interject that so that people who are listening understand that was not a doctrinal statement.
Yeah, no, and thank you. But it just goes back to, if you're going to say something to someone, assume they're going to believe you, because I believed that. And people can't come back and say, oh, that's a bunch of baloney, you shouldn't have believed that. It's too late. I believed it for 20 years and I acted on it. And the damage that came from holding this belief, which was not doctrinal and was not true and was told kind of as a scare story, did damage to me, along with a lot of this other stuff. And you can't just wave your hand and say, oh, you shouldn't have believed that because that's silly, after the damage has already been done. Yeah, so I told my mission president, and he said, a lot of people struggle with this. It's very common.
And what were you confessing about? Nice. You were confessing about masturbating and looking at porn?
I only bring this up for people who may be doing the same mental gymnastics that I was doing, which I think a lot of people do, because you get very desperate in these situations. So we didn't have access to pornography or anything like that. This was before missionaries could really do email. Going back to that, thoughts, words, actions, all that stuff, and they get progressively more serious. So in my head, as a missionary, I was thinking, okay, I'm feeling this like I'm going to lose it, like I'm going to relapse some way or another. So what is the least bad way that I can do this? What's going to bring the least condemnation on me? And so I was thinking through all that stuff, and I thought, okay, as long as I don't actually touch myself or anything like that, that would be worse, because that's an action. And so I would actually just think. I was actually able to think my way to orgasm without actually touching, which is funny because it took so much longer, and I was having to think through and create these really vivid scenarios and things like that, and it would take a long time. But in my head, that was less bad than actually physically doing something, even though doing that, it's it'd be over and done with. And so then once I discovered the ability to do this, then that became an issue as well, because then it's like, hey, you don't have access to pornography, but you can just think yourself up some. I had that to deal with as well. So anyway, I struggle with that for the latter part of my mission. And then after my mission,
I'm actually going to interject again. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah. No, go ahead.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because every time I talk to non-Mormon professionals about masturbation and pornography, they'll say, well, the pornography discussion is really just about masturbation, because everybody's masturbating while they're looking at porn. It's pretty common for me to hear this type of story from Mormon men, that actually the pornography was, that was bad enough. So yeah. That's all I wanted to do. I wasn't going to, on top of that, masturbate. So that's an interesting thing that is not that uncommon.
Yeah, and I think, and I mean, it's really embarrassing to talk about a lot of this stuff, but yeah, I think that the more open I've become, and the more people I've talked to, and the more people who kind of know that I am someone who has kind of had experience with this, It is so common. It's just, it would be funny if it wasn't so depressing. Again, why we're doing this this podcast and talking about this stuff. But so after my mission, I kind of struggled for a little bit, because your whole life is planned out for you. As a Mormon, it's like you go to school, and then you go on your mission, and then you get home from your mission, and then you get married in the temple, and you have a bunch of kids and all this stuff. But that gap between when you go on a mission, which happens at a fixed time, at a fixed age typically, and when you get married, is I kind of termed it the young single adult limbo. And that was very disorienting, because I knew what the next step was, but I didn't really feel like I had control over it. And so, I went on dates and stuff like that, and I really just wanted to be married, and things wouldn't work out, and it was just very disheartening and frustrating and things like that. And at one point, I dated this girl who was not a member, and I was kind of in a fairly jaded and disillusioned mind frame at this time, just feeling frustrated and stuff like that. And I wasn't doing anything. I was still going to church every Sunday and reading my scriptures and doing all this stuff, but I wasn't kind of as anxiously engaged as I had been in the past, and knew I probably should be. And so I ended up dating this girl who was a non-member, and was kind of unprepared for a lot of the kind of dynamics that happened there. We ended up making out a lot and stuff like that, and I ended up feeling really badly about some of those things, and this is really bad. Like, what am I doing? Like, I'm such a screw up. I'm dating this girl who I can't marry, and I just ended up feeling really tearing myself up about this, and feeling like I needed to go confess to the bishop that I just was this terrible person. I remember at my BYU dorm, I was in the shower after this, and I just took my fingernails up, and I just put my hands on my shoulders and just scratched just tore my skin kind of, and left these big kind of bloody claw marks down my arms, as part of just this self-loathing that I was feeling, because of this stuff, and just feeling so terrible, like I wanted to hurt myself because I felt like I deserved it, for what I was doing. And then I went and told the bishop, and he was just kind of a nice, unassuming guy, and he asked me some stuff and thing, and then he basically just forgave me and said, like, you've done the right thing coming to talk to me. It's just like, you know the right thing to do, like, what you need to do, like, just go and do it, and you'll be fine. The Lord is, the Lord forgives you. And I remember walking home from that meeting with him and just being furious, that it was that easy, and being so angry that I felt so horribly about myself and what I was doing, that I was clawing myself in the shower, and he just says, "You're forgiven." And it just didn't make sense to me. Looking back on it now, I think it goes to the whole, it's like, hold on, like, you're like, any sexual sin is the sin next to murder in the eyes of God. I have believed that. I have invested in that idea. I have been suicidal over that idea. And now I come and talk to you, my priesthood leader, and tell you all this stuff, and you said the Lord forgives you. And it just didn't add up. And I didn't realize that that's why I was so angry at the time, but I was just furious. And I remember I went back to my room and I prayed, and I said, "Heavenly Father, it's not fair." I said, "It's not fair that I should get off so easily." I'm like, do something to me, punish me. Like, I deserve this, and I don't deserve to be forgiven this way for what I've done. As I was praying, I just felt this kind of spiritual confirmation, like, no, you're okay. And it was so discordant with all of the messaging I'd heard my whole life. Now, even just as I'm talking about it now, I think maybe started to lay, to cause some of the cracks that would later come to where I really reevaluated everything with God and with the church and with the moral significance of pornography and things like that. It was so inconsistent that I had felt so badly about all this stuff, and then the church would just, God and my bishop would just say, you're forgiven, and that was it. And it just didn't make sense.
It's not just history or current cultural issues that drive that reevaluation of your relationship with your faith, but for a lot of people, it's their relationship with their sexuality.
Yeah, and that's a huge thing to me, I think, again, and going back to that positivist versus negativist approach, and just this whole idea of ignoring sexuality as a fundamental part of being human, I think just sows the seeds of so many problems. And it's not just a Mormon thing at all. I mean, it's all over the place. And I wrote down a thought the other day that trying to develop any kind of system or plan for humans that doesn't assume sexuality as a fundamental tenet of that system is like trying to develop a theory of physics without assuming gravity, without accounting for gravity. It's something that's so fundamental that if you ignore it, you're just going to run into all kinds of problems and inexplicable things that don't make sense because you're missing this huge variable that you can't ignore.
Okay, so 2 more quick questions before we turn the tide into the second part of this interview, which will be more like, now what?
Yeah.
But so let me just kind of go through some of the assessment questions. In other words, what was the frequency that you were dealing with either masturbation or pornography for the majority of the time that you're talking about, which is adolescence and college age, missionary age self?
Oh, I don't recall at that time. It was never very, like, sometimes it would be like one day, and then I'd be like, well, I'm already screwed. I'm already, in the hole. So might as well do it again. So then I'd do it the next day. So I'd do like 1 or 2, or maybe, very rarely 3 days in a row. And then I would go for
And you're talking
weeks.
about once a day.
Yeah, just once. And then I would go for weeks and sometimes months before the next time, because I was constantly resisting and trying to not do it. The period before my mission, I mean, that was over 1.5 years where I didn't do anything at all. And then when before I got married, before Mitzi and I got married, it had been, I think, over 2 years that I had been, hadn't done anything. And so, but then kind of into marriage, once I kind of settled into a rhythm and really started to try and figure out, okay, this is not something that's going away. What do I do about it? That frequency was about once every 6 weeks, every month and a half.
Okay, so I just want the weight of that to just kind of settle for a minute.
I was an addict. What can I say?
Oh man.
In my own mind, and I think in most people's minds, that is addiction.
Well, and I'm consistently surprised at how often those kinds of questions are not even asked as far as frequency? Because if we just take your word for it, it could be very easy to assume that this was happening multiple times a day. You know, the way you talk about it, right? The drive and having to put up pictures on my computer so I wouldn't do this, and you know, the constant thinking about it. The perception could be that, you know, you're spending hours in front of the computer, you know, multiple times a day. Which,
losing
you know,
jobs over it.
sure, and some people do get to the point where their behavior becomes problematic to those levels. But even then, I guess my next question, which I'm leading into, is why then is this not an addiction? I could see a lot of people posing that question to me, which has been, you know, what I've been trying to educate about for the last, probably, I think I've got now 7 podcasts on this topic alone, just on Mormon Sex Info, about why this does not qualify as an addiction. And what are your thoughts about that? And maybe Mitzi, you can share your thoughts too. Why wouldn't, you know, as you're maybe even hearing your husband talk about this, I don't know, that's kind of what we'll get into in the next part, is how you started having conversations about this as a couple. But why isn't this fall into, you know, you've got a drive, you can't control it, it's ongoing, it's compulsive, like you say, you're getting up in the middle of the night and you don't even know how to stop yourself. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, what I was going to say about it is that's what I hate about the rhetoric that we have about porn addiction in our culture. If anyone has any type of relationship with porn, it doesn't matter. They don't ever ask the frequency. They are a porn addict. If they can't be 100% abstinent, they're an addict. And that makes me crazy, because it's like, if someone looks at it once a month, or if someone's looking at it for hours a day, in the church's minds, and if everyone in the majority of the people in the congregation see that as the same thing.
Yeah.
And it's not, and it makes me crazy.
Yeah, and I think for me, and you know, and I mean, it goes back to the sin next to murder. And so how much murder is too much? Or how much murder is an acceptable amount? That's the way I was approaching it. And so I was just like, no amount is acceptable at all. And so, you know, I just was so desperate to not do it at all, because it was so heavy to me. And if your definition of addiction is basically stops at a behavior you want to stop that you can't. Like, if that's your definition of addiction, then yeah, I was an addict. And I think a lot of people, that's as far as their definition goes. But you're absolutely right, you know, but what about the frequency? And you know, I remember reading an article when I was doing my research throughout this process of you know, someone recounting a story where a bishop got a call from a former congregation member who was standing on the roof of a building saying that they were going to jump because they felt so unworthy because they had masturbated twice in 18 months.
This goes back to the normalizing of it too, where Scott with the OCD, if that person would have been like, yeah, you're really messed up, like, you shouldn't have visions like that, that's scary, then he would have been so much more messed up. And it's like, if we could normalize it a little bit, people wouldn't be thinking about it all the time, or trying to not think about looking at it all the time. It would not overtake people's lives the way that it does.
The interesting discussion I had with Dr. Prowse was this idea that really the only criteria that fits for pornography, as far as when you look at the criteria for addiction, is that it hits the pleasure center of the brain. And but that's true of, you know, biting my nails as well as eating chocolate, or, you know, texting friends. So there's all kinds of things that we can do, and even do excessively, but that we would never talk about from an addiction standpoint. We would talk more about like finding balance in your life, or, you know, how do you hear this all the time, and even in our Mormon culture, like, you can choose, you know, there's too many good things to choose from. You have to kind of decide how you're going to spend your time, time management skills and those types of things, coping mechanisms. And there's people who exercise too much, for goodness grief, right? So, but we don't talk about exercise addiction. And so, so that's really interesting, and why I think it's such an important message to continue to put forth, because our culture has so integrated this message. And there's one recent quote from Elder Oaks in an Ensign article where he finally, in one small paragraph of otherwise a pretty, again, what I would call provocative rhetoric around this issue, which means, you're talking about it from this evil, pernicious kind of language. It's in of itself heightens anxiety. But he does quote about a spectrumed approach, that not everybody would qualify for, again, an addiction. He's still talking about from an addiction model, but he, at least for the first time that I've heard of, says something around the lines that not everybody would qualify for that type of a diagnosis, which doesn't exist to begin with. However, this is what, thousands of people are being treated with in our culture.
It makes me want to have them watch the movie Requiem for a Dream if they want to know what addiction looks like and what it can do to people's lives.
Yeah.
That movie's dealing with drugs, and we just need to have, a reality check with this stuff. We are creating huge problems in our culture, and it's so maddening.
Yeah. My mantra I'll end with is, cocaine doesn't know that you're Mormon, but pornography does.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very true.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
A trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary.